Hey everyone, it's Russ, and welcome to another episode of Women's Retirement Radio. Today, I am excited to introduce you to Lynn Cherry. Lynn and I met each other online, and I'm excited for Lynn to join us and to share our conversation around what is the fastest growing sport, if not in the USA, maybe the world. Lynn can certainly address that. But Lynn, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're here too. Why don't we get started by you just telling us a little bit about who you are and what it is you're working on?
Right. So I learned about the game of pickleball, which I had never heard of until about 3 years ago. And it's a wonderful sport. And, for those of you who are, probably like me in their 50s, kind of late 50s in my case, I was moved to Connecticut and I from Texas, and I'm like, oh, what the heck am I going to do? And so I found the game of pickleball through the local recreation center, and I had never heard of it before. But as Russ mentioned, it is the fastest growing sport in the USA, and so many of the people who play it are in the over 50 age group. Many people certainly who are retired, they'll spend hours on the court each day just because the sport's so fun. And, if you're looking for something to do during retirement, it's definitely a great option. And even if you're not to that point yet, like I'm not, it's still, there's always a opportunity to play this great game.
What about pickleball specifically, Lynn, kind of drew you in? I mean, it seems like you're kind of all in on pickleball now. I know you've got the website and the podcast, both called Pickleball Fire. And just doing a little research and looking into your background, you've got a fairly athletic background. So I'm just curious what appealed to you about pickleball versus maybe other activities or other sports that were available to you after you moved from Texas to Connecticut.
Right. When I moved, I actually at the time had not been doing any court type sports because I had completely torn a ligament in my knee. And actually, I never really thought that I would be able to play, kind of a competitive sport again, as opposed to like just walking or doing something like that. But I'm not somebody who really likes the cold at all. So the first thing I did was actually looked in the at the recreation center to see what was available, and there was something called pickleball, and I'm like, well, what is that? I've never heard of it. So I Googled it and looked at it, what it was on YouTube, and I'm like, oh yeah, I think that's something that I would really enjoy, and I think I can probably go ahead and play the sport because it's on a much smaller court than, say, a tennis court. The court itself is really more the size of a racquetball court, and it's actually exactly the same size as a badminton court. And the thing about pickleball too is it's a very social game. So much of when you're playing, more than likely, you will actually be playing doubles as opposed to singles. So definitely that's why it was very appealing to me with my knee issues. I'm like, I can really have a lot of fun, again, play a sport with a ball, and it's much easier on my body. And that's what everybody says. I mean, that's why I've got friends, who will start off at 6 a.m. every day, and they literally play till noon. And we're talking about people who are just recreational players, so it's a very appealing sport. It's very, very fun and easy on the body.
And you mentioned I think one of the fastest growing age groups that are playing pickleball is kind of the 50 plus age range. And you mentioned that it has the potential to be a very social activity, a very social sport. But as I understand it, it can also be as competitive as you want it to be. I understand that, there are tournaments and televised events and things like that. So I assume for those listening that maybe want to potentially use pickleball as a more competitive outlet, that's an option for them as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are so many tournaments throughout, especially the US and Canada. And nowadays there is even a professional pickleball tour. In fact, there's two of them, and they both started during 2020. So pickleball is actually going much more in the mainstream now, since it's being televised on TV. In fact, I think in a couple weeks, there'll be some pickleball on the Tennis Channel. Interestingly enough, I'm going just to watch a tournament in the Orlando area, and they're going to broadcast some of it on the Tennis Channel, which is great. It's also been on ESPN and CBS Network. And of course, every professional event is also live streamed on YouTube. So, the sport, you can come into the sport and just, for absolute fun. But if you're somebody who's a little bit more competitive, there's a lot of tournament opportunities. And there's also a lot of leagues now popping up.
Interesting. So before we maybe talk a little bit more about the game, could you maybe paint a little clearer picture about your involvement? I mean, clearly you're a participant, you play and enjoy it, but what motivated you to kind of get more involved and start your website and the podcast, and maybe share some other things that you're doing to maybe be involved and build awareness around the sport of pickleball?
It's really interesting. When I first started, I think it was probably literally a month after I played pickleball for the first time, I'm like, this is probably the greatest sport I've ever played. So I realized that, I'm gonna put up a website and, write some content, help bring other people to the game. And I really didn't have a plan for the website at all. I mean, not at all. But I did start producing content, put up some videos on YouTube, and, I was able to, bring a lot of people to the website. And then, in 2020, we had COVID-19 happen, and I was very conservative in terms of where I went. And so actually, I really didn't play any pickleball in 2020. But if you think about it, I'm stuck indoors pretty much the whole time in the winter here in Connecticut. So I'm like, well, what am I going to do? I've got lots of free time. And that's when I started the Pickleball Fire podcast. And the way I've structured the podcast is, there's a lot of people who certainly want tips from the pros and other instructors and coaches. So on Mondays, I actually have somebody like that. And when I release an episode, it's, something with, so you can learn more about the game, lots of instructional tips. And then there's so much going on just with the growth of the sport in general, and so many things happening in the industry. On Thursdays, I release a podcast, which is, somebody from the industry, whether it's, a commentator for one of the pro events or a paddle manufacturer or whatnot. That's kind of the Thursday episode. And then given the fact that there's, so many people who are playing the game are over 50, I realize not a lot of, at least my age group, listens to podcasts. And I'm like, I have really great content that's coming in, especially from the pros and the coaches, and just some really neat profiles too. So I thought, well, let me put my journalism background to use and let me start writing up, articles from the podcast, because there was just so much content. So that's how I started the Pickleball Fire magazine. And right now it's a digital magazine that goes out to about 15 to 20,000 people.
Wow.
And it's gotten some good traction, probably even more so than the podcast, but the podcast is really growing too. So, as I mentioned, when I started the website, I really didn't have a specific plan or a business plan or anything like that. But everything is kind of growing with the sport. It was really a good time to start doing what I did when it comes to pickleball.
Yeah, sounds like it. Well, and congrats on the growth and the big and presumably growing audience. That's fantastic. And we'll be sure, of course, to share links to your website and podcast and digital magazine and everything in the show notes for this episode, so people can definitely reach out or sign up to learn more. So, could you, clearly as I think there's name recognition with pickleball and the sport, and it's growing as you've mentioned. I think probably more people than not are going to be familiar with it. But I think it might be helpful if you wouldn't mind, just at a high level, maybe explain a little bit about the game, how it's played, what's involved, just to give people that maybe aren't familiar with the sport a little bit more of a introduction to what's involved if it's something they're interested in and maybe, trying out.
Sure. When it comes to the actual game of pickleball, it's kind of a cross between tennis, badminton, and ping pong. So if you've ever played either of those three sports, I can pretty much guarantee you're going to love pickleball. But the game, as I mentioned before, it is played on a smaller court. So it's a lot less running, but it can be also a very fast game. And the biggest difference from, say something like tennis is that we actually do not have a racket that's strung. It's literally a paddle, typically about 15 by 8 inches. And the game is played with a wiffle ball. So interestingly enough, the game kind of has a slow component, and we'll call it a fast component. So at the net, actually, I should explain the one thing about pickleball. Probably the first thing, if you ever go and try and play, is people will tell you about the kitchen. The kitchen is an area on both sides of the net, and it's 7 feet from the net. And that is an area where you cannot step in and hit the ball in that area unless the ball has bounced. And I'll tell you the reason for that rule. It was really interesting that when the game was invented, there was 3 families playing with their kids, and they kind of wanted to level the playing field. And I guess one of the founders, he was very tall. So they didn't want him to have that advantage at the net like you might in tennis if you're really tall. So that's why we've got the kitchen and pickleball that you have to stay out of unless the ball bounces. So if the ball's in the air, you cannot be in the kitchen hitting it. So if you're at a place on the court where you're just behind the kitchen line, a lot of times when you've got the 4 players at the net, the game can become very, very fast. Even though you're just playing with a wiffle ball, that's kind of we'll call that the fast game. And then there's also kind of what's called the slow game in pickleball, which is, if you think like maybe a drop shot in tennis, that's kind of a slower shot, and that's kind of akin to dinking or a third shot drop. So the game is, a lot of people, consider pickleball to be very much a game of strategy, and it's more like chess than checkers. So there is a lot of thinking, especially at the higher level in terms of strategy. So it's just a really interesting, mix of a lot of different things. And it's, I would say the other thing too about pickleball is that people are very welcoming. That's definitely something you'll hear. So it's really a great place to socialize, meet people. And even if you've never played a sport before, you will typically be welcomed in. Of course, if you've, done anything like a racket sport, you'll pick things up pretty darn quickly.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'll admit I'm learning alongside our listeners here. So if I understood you correctly, if you're in the kitchen within that 7 feet zone on either side of the net, you basically can't volley. The ball has to bounce first. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
But if you're if you're outside the kitchen and someone hits a shot at you and it hasn't bounced yet, you could volley it. Is that right?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. Once you hit that volley, you cannot then step into the kitchen over that line. So you've got to volley completely outside of the kitchen.
Interesting. Okay. Well, yeah, and I can imagine how that could pick up the pace quite a bit if you've got 4 people all up at the net, keeping the ball in play like that. That sounds like that could be a lot of fun. What you mentioned the paddles and things like that. If someone says, "Man, this sounds really fun. I'd love to give it a try or at least go watch." Are there any online resources where people can find, pickleball organizations or games or organizations in their kind of local geography?
Yes, actually, on the Pickleball Fire website, I have a list of courts throughout the US and also into Canada. So it's really easy. All you have to do is enter your city or your zip code, and any courts near you will pop up. And, typically at this time, well, this will probably be released a little bit later, but in the summertime, almost anywhere you go play, you go to the courts and there'll be somewhere in the mornings. The other thing too is if you go in, and that's actually just go to pickleballfire.com/courts. You can also do a search for instructors if you would rather, get some instruction to learn how to play. But again, you don't even necessarily need an instructor to go play. You just need to find a place to play. And generally people will show you how to play the first time you show up. And that's exactly what happened to me. Is the first time I went to play, I said, "Hey, I'm brand new. I don't even really know the rules." And so I played with somebody, Paul, who became a really, really great friend. So yeah, so just again, just go to pickleballfire.com/instructors or /courts, and you can definitely find places to play. Now, one other thing I should probably mention is the equipment. I mean, typically pickleball is played indoor or outdoors. There is indoor balls, there's outdoor balls, but probably the key thing when you first go to play is just make sure you've got a paddle. You can purchase a decent paddle for $40 or $50. If you've got a family and you want to get your kids into it, then for probably $100, you can get 3 or 4 balls and 4 paddles. But if you're somebody who, comes from a racket sports background, you might want to spend, more like $50 on a paddle to get started.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to ask about the equipment because I'm imagining that somebody that hasn't done it before and wants to give it a try, they might want to go out and see if they could maybe rent or borrow a paddle. I don't even know if that's an option or if it's just kind of expected that you kind of show up and bring your own paddle as a first timer.
In most cases, it's expected that you would bring a paddle. Yeah, I certainly did before I came, and just about everybody who I've seen come onto the court when they were just first starting, people pretty much always bring paddles. There aren't usually a lot of spare ones around. Somebody might have an extra one in their bag. Actually, that happened when I went to go watch the very first time. They're like, "Oh, you should come in and play," and I'm like, "Oh, no," because I didn't have any equipment or anything. But actually, I think in that case somebody did pull a paddle out of their bag. But yeah, if you can, if just purchase one before you go, it's probably the best option.
Well, even with based on like the price ranges you just threw out, and even with the cost of a paddle, it still seems like it's a very accessible, inexpensive activity or inexpensive sport to get started in. Would you characterize it that way?
Absolutely. And what's great is, even into October in most places, you'll be able to play outdoors. Typically outdoor facilities through most of the country, you can play at parks and whatnot. So there's no fees. And, when it turns cold here in Connecticut, I will need to move indoors. But a lot of times the senior centers will have a gym. And typically at the senior center, there really isn't a cost or it's a very nominal fee just to become a member of the senior center. So that's what I do. Other options, a lot of YMCAs now have pickleball. And some of actually a lot of the indoor tennis centers now do. Pretty much, I think anybody nowadays who has a tennis facility is, if they have tennis, they have pickleball. And of course, it gets a little bit more costly if you're having to join a club or even pay for drop-in fees. And, anytime it's indoors, it does tend to be a little bit more expensive as opposed to just playing at a park.
Yeah. Well, based on everything you're sharing with us, I can't imagine that anyone listening to this has any excuses not to go out and give it a try if it's something they're interested in. It sounds very widespread and quickly growing and very accessible as you explained. So I think it's safe to say you would definitely encourage people to go out and give it a try and see if it's something they enjoy.
Absolutely. And that's a very fun way to be fit. And the great thing is it's an easy sport to learn. So even if you've never really done anything like that, what I always say is if you can, grab a wiffle ball and throw it underhanded over the net, then you can play pickleball, because some of the soft game in pickleball is basically that's like mimicking, that dink shot. So it's a great way just to get started and, get on out there.
Yeah. So you kind of discovered or stumbled into pickleball, I think you said about 3 years ago. Looking back through all of your experience, both playing, observing, writing about it, sharing your experience with others, what's something that you maybe would have done differently based on what you know now versus what you knew then? So, and I'm not sure there is an answer here, but I'm just curious that now that you've gotten what sounds like pretty immersed in the sport, I'm just wondering if there's anything you would have done differently as far as kind of your entry into the game or how you started playing, or is it a situation where you wouldn't really change anything?
Honestly, I wish I would have started sooner.
Yeah.
That's the key thing. I mean, it's really odd because the sport was actually invented in Washington State. And I think it's popular here in Connecticut because pickleball is so crazy popular in Florida. And so since you've got all the snowbirds going back and forth here, I think that's why it really grew in the Northeast. Whereas when I left Texas in 2018, nobody was playing pickleball. In fact, I spoke with one of the coaches out there, teaching pros out there in the Dallas area, which is near where I was. And he said, Lynn, literally in the city of Dallas, there's 4 outdoor courts, like a total of 4. That's it. So it just for whatever reason, 3 years ago, people were just not doing it in that part of the country. But now with the pandemic actually really helped the sport to grow, because even the New York Times called it, the best pandemic sport to do, because it's something where if you can even play it in your driveway. I mean, you can get like if you've got a regular sized driveway, you can get a 10-foot net and you can start hitting the ball around on your driveway. You can draw, chalk some lines on the court. A smaller net's probably about $50. If you want like a full regulation size net, it's about $100 if you've got the room. But I think that's really led to so much of the boom, because the sport grew about 20% in 2020. And a lot of that people attribute to the pandemic.
Interesting. And it's so funny when I have the opportunity to ask someone a question like that, like what would you have done differently? Almost inevitably, the folks that really love what they're doing, so they wish they would have started sooner. So I think if nothing else you share with us today is an indicator, that certainly tells us you've found something you really love and are passionate about, which is fantastic. Part of my work with women as they're getting ready to retire, transition into kind of that next chapter of life, I always try to emphasize that it's very important to think very holistically about your wealth, your life, and it's not just a financial perspective, but also thinking about your fitness, your health, your activity levels, and things like this. And I can't help but think, having spoken with you, Lynn, and having you shared about pickleball and how accessible and easy and fun it is to play, I can't help but think what a great fit it could be for a lot of women out there that are maybe thinking, all right, well, now if I'm retiring from work, or if my kids are now up and out of the house, for example, and I've got more time on my hands, what a great way to spend your time, stay a little bit more active, meet some new people, kind of maybe develop some new social groups that maybe you lose if you're giving up full-time work, for example. So have you in your play and in your writing and discussions with people in and around pickleball, I'm curious, you've said a couple of times that kind of one of the fastest growing age groups playing pickleball is the 50 plus age range. Have you seen it be a little bit more favored towards women versus men, or is it a pretty healthy mix of the two?
It is actually a very healthy mix. In fact, I came from a sport which was racquetball, and that was a sport where it was really male dominated. Pickleball is totally different. It is definitely more 50-50. I think certainly in the older age group above 50, it's probably pretty close to being a split. So it's sometimes I go to the courts and there's way more women than men. Today was a pretty even split, but I remember one day last week it was probably 60% women, maybe 70%.
Interesting. And just out of curiosity, how often are you out on the pickleball court?
Well, until recently, I didn't get nearly as much chance to play because I was working my full-time corporate job, kind of those 9 to 5 type hours. But just last month, I decided to quit my job. By no means retiring. Actually, I really enjoy working. But I just decided that I was ready to do something else after kind of doing the same thing for 6.5 years. And, one of the things I did want to do was to focus a little bit more, not necessarily on playing pickleball, but on the website, magazine, podcast. So now I probably play 4 or 5 times a week. I'm somebody who I like my game to improve, and I like to drill. So typically I'll play competitively one day and then I'll drill the next day and kind of alternate. This week was a little bit unusual because we're expecting bad weather 2 days in the week, Wednesday and Thursday. So this week I did actually go play competitively for 2 days. But one of the things that, I've kind of had to work up to is going from playing, maybe twice a week for an hour and a half at a time to playing, 4 or 5 days, for 2 hours at a time or more. So I've kind of worked myself, into that level over the last couple of months.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. It sounds like a big change, a big decision to kind of move away from your current full-time gig. And wherever you land next, it sounds kind of cool that you've got more time to spend doing something you love, which is both playing pickleball, but I'm sure that also frees up more time for you to, write and put out the magazine and work on the podcast and the website. So that sounds fantastic. I'm happy for you, and I'll be interested to see where you head next now that you've left your full-time work for the time being. Lynn, we've covered a lot. Is there anything that I didn't ask you, or anything that we didn't touch on that you think is important for our listeners to know, either about you or just about the sport of pickleball in general?
What I would just say overall is, if you can, get up off the couch and just go try it. Just about everybody I talk to says the first time they played the sport, they just loved it and they become addicted to it. So give it a try. Like I said, you can go to the pickleballfire.com website to learn more just about everything about pickleball. So I hope you can get out there and enjoy it like so many other people are.
Well, I think that's a great place to, wrap up our conversation. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be sure to include links to your website, the podcast, the digital magazine. We'll even be sure to highlight the instructor and the court directory that the links to those you've set up on your website as well. And Lynn, I just want to say thank you. I consider myself lucky that we connected recently and decided to make time to have this conversation and share with our listeners more about you and more about the sport of pickleball, which clearly you love, and it's had a great impact on your life. So I'm really excited that we could have this conversation today.
Well, thanks so much. I really enjoyed being on.
Yeah, me too. And everyone out there listening, thank you again. This is Russ from Women's Retirement Radio, and we'll look forward to catching up with you on our next episode. It's Russ again. And before you go, I want to provide a brief disclosure. You should consult a financial advisor familiar with the specific circumstances of your unique financial situation before making any financial decisions. Nothing in this broadcast constitutes a solicitation for the sale or purchase of any securities. Any mentioned rates of return are historical or hypothetical in nature and are not a guarantee of future returns. I'm a financial advisor and an investment advisor representative of WealthCare Capital Management, LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor based in Richmond, Virginia. The views discussed in this podcast are my own and may not be consistent with or represent those of WealthCare Capital Management.